Warlord Thurok had reviewed the biological assessments, the conflict records, the political maps, the average lifespan, and concluded, with the certainty of someone who has never been seriously wrong about anything that could still hurt him, that humanity was not a problem. The files were thorough. He'd made sure of that. Average height, 1.6 to 2 meters. Lifespan, shamefully brief. Political cohesion fractured across dozens of independent governing bodies that spent considerable energy disagreeing with each other. Military loss ratios across recorded engagements. Adequate, in the way a rock falling on your foot was adequate at causing discomfort. Nothing in the data suggested a species requiring serious strategic consideration. Everything in it suggested a species that had survived primarily by occupying worlds no one else had bothered to want. He shared this assessment with his second Verath, who laughed, a low, resonant sound from somewhere behind those armored jaw ridges, and asked whether the meeting needed to be long. Thurok told him to prepare full honors for the entry procession anyway, not out of respect, out of the specific pleasure of making something small understand exactly what it was looking at. The arbitration chamber on Hollow Meridian was everything that world always was. Precise, commercially optimized, aesthetically neutral. The Thenari diplomatic facilitators had arranged the space with the careful attention their kind brought to any staging where impressions would be made and remembered. Balanced geometry, warm, even lighting, seating scaled for multiple species morphologies. Every surface communicated the same quiet message. What happens here matters. The Thenari themselves moved through the preparations with fluid, economical grace. Tall and composed, gold and bronze skin tones catching the chamber light, posture upright, their deep violet eyes sharp and missing nothing. They understood the weight of formal introduction better than most. They had been conducting them for a very long time. The human delegation arrived first. 8 people, formal dress, diplomatic credentials, and in the military attaché position, a single Marine in service uniform, a woman of middle height, dark-haired, with a lean and weathered composure that suggested she had stood in rooms like this before and found none of them particularly intimidating. Major Mara Ilian took her position at the delegation table with the economy of someone who does not waste energy on performance. She reviewed the room once, registered the exits, and went still. In the technical observer gallery above, separated from the main floor by a transparent partition and roughly 8 meters of vertical distance, Jonah Vale was eating something wrapped in transit foil and reading a structural assessment report on a tablet. He was there professionally, contracted to inspect Hollow Meridian's orbital connector infrastructure. He had finished 2 days early and been invited to observe as a courtesy because someone in the diplomatic corps had liked his last infrastructure brief. Ceremony didn't interest him much. He was, however, very good at watching how things moved, and he looked up from his report when the chamber doors at the far end opened. The Draith delegation entered with full military honors. 7 of them, and the room responded the way rooms respond when something large and certain of itself decides to occupy the space. Thurok led, standing at the upper edge of 2 meters, his frame dense with the particular density of something that had evolved on a world actively trying to kill everything that lived on it. His scales were deep gray, nearly black along the cranial ridges that rose in natural armored plates from his skull. His eyes, dark amber, vertically pupilled, swept the chamber in a single pass. Not curious, categorizing. His second Verath walked a half-step behind him, slightly shorter, already wearing an expression that had no diplomatic function whatsoever. The Thenari facilitator stepped forward and began the formal introduction, voice carrying through the chamber's acoustics in precisely the way it had been designed to carry things. Thurok listened, the way powerful things listen to formalities, with just enough attention to be technically present, and not one fraction more. When the human delegation was introduced by name and title, his amber eyes moved to Mara Elian with the quality of an assessment rather than a greeting. He took in her height, her build, the uniform, the medals, the stillness of her posture, and arrived at a conclusion in approximately 3 seconds. Verath didn't take 3 seconds. He laughed almost immediately, that same low, resonant sound from the first contact briefing, but louder now, with an audience. He said something in Draith Combat Register that the translation unit rendered with a slight delay and a diplomatic softening that still couldn't disguise what it was, a comment about whether the human military assigned its soldiers by height or by some other criterion he hadn't yet identified, and whether the one standing before him had been selected as military attaché because the others were shorter. The Tenari facilitator's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind the violet eyes. The particular stillness of someone who has just witnessed an error and is calculating whether intervention will help or compound it. Mara Ilian let the translation finish. She looked at Thurak, not at Verath, at Thurak, which was itself a message, and when she spoke, her voice was the most unimpressive sound in the room. Flat, factual, no heat anywhere in it. We'll get to that later. The Draith read this as a species that had been told its place and accepted it. The Thenari facilitator read it as something she would be writing about in her session notes for a long time. In the observer gallery, Jonah Vale set down his transit foil, studied Mara Ilian for a long moment, and wrote something briefly in the margin of his structural report. Later, when someone asked what he had written, he said he'd noted that the Draith were making a specific kind of mistake, the kind engineers make right before catastrophic structural failure. They were measuring what they could see and calling it everything. He had watched it happen to bridges, to pressure systems, to people who thought they understood a material because they had read the spec sheet. Karados Station sat in low orbit above a world that had never been beautiful and had stopped pretending. The planet below was rust and salt, and the particular cold that strips ambition down to function. Corrosive seasonal winds, broken extraction planes, survivor settlements dug into old infrastructure because the infrastructure was the warmest thing available. The colony had been there 60 years. It had failed twice and been rebuilt twice. The third iteration simply stopped failing, the way things do when the people running them have run out of alternatives and discovered that this, in fact, is sufficient motivation. The station above managed water processor uplinks, cargo transit windows, and civilian extraction routes when radiation storms made surface operations untenable. By any reasonable strategic assessment, it was a secondary installation, modestly armed, modestly staffed, positioned above a resource-marginal colony that appeared on Draith intelligence maps as an afterthought. In the Draith strategic model, this made it the appropriate first target for a demonstration. The strike element arrived without warning in the way things only arrive without warning when significant effort has gone into removing all the warnings. 2 assault landers and a suppression cruiser, moving on a transit profile that Karados's external sensors registered as commercial traffic until the distance collapsed too fast to be commercial anything. The opening salvo was efficient. The long-range comms array went dark in the first strike. A second hit bent the primary docking seal's blast door into its own housing, sealing the mid-ring from emergency access for anyone without a cutting torch or an intimate knowledge of the station's secondary maintenance pathways. Power fluctuations cascaded through the upper habitation ring. In the first 90 seconds, Karados looked exactly like a station in the process of dying. Mara Ilian's first command on internal channel was one word: sections. Not the word of someone improvising. Every surviving crew member already knew what it meant, because she had made them practice it during what the Marines had called, not entirely charitably, the Major's Paranoid Tuesday drills. Sector lockdown, head count, casualties forward, no wasted movement. The station's 31 Marines, its skeleton crew, and its 47 civilians, contractors, dock workers, water systems technicians, moved into their assigned positions with the organized urgency of people who are frightened and trained simultaneously, which is a different thing from people who are merely frightened. In the mid-ring maintenance corridor, Jonah Vale was bleeding from a head gash acquired when a conduit housing came off the ceiling during the power surge. He was also holding his diagnostic tablet, which he had not put down. He assessed the wound by touch, not critical, inconvenient, and turned his attention to the station schematic with the focus of someone who has decided the current situation is primarily an engineering problem. He found Sarah, a dock worker, who had been guiding a cargo pallet to Bay 7 when the shooting started, and was now crouching behind it with the expression of someone who had not signed up for this, and would like to register a formal complaint with someone appropriate as soon as an appropriate someone became available. Jonah crouched beside her and showed her the schematic. The water processor uplink channels ran through the station's secondary power grid. Infrastructure, the Draith sensors would have logged as utility systems, not weapon systems, because that's what they were. The pressurized cargo loading array drew from the same secondary grid, and the station orbited a world whose cold was so thorough and so specific, it stripped paint off ship hulls in under an hour. He explained what he was going to do. 3 sentences. Sarah looked at the schematic. She looked at the corridor leading to the loading array control room. Then she stood up and left the cargo pallet where it was. She helped him without asking again. The Draith boarding team breached the mid-ring expecting one thing and found another. They expected panic, fragmentation, the particular disorganization of a species that had not anticipated being tested and had no cultural framework for absorbing the test gracefully. Instead, they found kill corridors, constructed with the functional creativity of people who had spent careers moving cargo and had suddenly found themselves moving it for entirely different reasons. Bonded containers, precisely placed, maintenance hatches locked open at angles that provided cover in one direction and sightlines in another, lighting reduced in specific sectors not because power had failed, but because someone had deliberately failed it. The defense didn't retreat past pre-assigned lines. Marines held positions that military doctrine, their own doctrine, would have flagged as untenable after the first casualty threshold. They held them anyway, at cost, with the particular human quality of refusing to accept the scenario written for them by someone who does not have their interests at heart. The Draith field officer transmitted back to the cruiser at the 2-hour mark. The message was short and carried the specific weight of a report no commander was going to enjoy receiving. The humans were still fighting in sectors they should have abandoned. Their casualties were real and documented, but the remaining defenders weren't contracting their perimeter in the pattern that force attrition should have produced. They were trading space for time in a way that suggested someone had calculated exactly how much space they had and was spending it with precision. Thurrock ordered increased pressure. In the same moment, he reviewed his projected timeline for the first time with something other than certainty, and found that the certainty had developed a hairline fracture. 6 hours in, Karados was damaged, partially depressurized in 2 sections, and running on emergency power managed through infrastructure channels that had no business managing emergency power and were doing it anyway, because Jonah Vale had spent 4 hours making it their business. He had also, in those 4 hours, done something more important. The long-range comms array was gone. What remained were the water processor uplinks, the cargo manifest relay, and a frequency band used for atmospheric insertion coordination that technically fell under civilian logistics infrastructure and was therefore absent from the Draith's priority suppression list. Jonah worked through the connections with a thoroughness that a properly rested person with full equipment would have found impressive. He accomplished it with a head wound, backup tools, and the assistance of two dock workers who had learned faster than anyone had asked them to. When the channel opened, he broadcast on it. Not a distress call, not a surrender request. A system status report delivered in the most procedurally accurate, infrastructurally specific, terminally boring language available to a senior contracted systems engineer who knew exactly what he was doing. Water processor uplink status, cargo manifest relay operational parameters, atmospheric insertion coordinate relay functionality, all of it precise, all of it embedded with navigational data that any human response system trained for emergency infrastructure analysis would immediately recognize as a tactical update, and all of it sounding, to anyone monitoring without that context, like a species too disorganized to panic correctly. The Dreth monitoring station logged it as civilian distress noise, standard for a failing installation. The response fleet had already been moving when the first emergency signals reached them, alerted by the frequencies Jonah had cracked open before the main relay closed. What his status report gave them wasn't the knowledge that Karados needed help. They knew that. It gave them a precise coordinate package embedded in logistics jargon, and from that package, a transit insertion calculation that arrived at a different answer than the Draith fire control systems expected. A faster answer. On the rust-colored surface below, the improvised counterfire came together the way things come together when a colony has spent 60 years learning that waiting for outside solutions is a hobby for people who live somewhere better. The atmospheric insertion rigs were already reconfigured. Post-strike analysis would later confirm the conversion had been underway for approximately 4 hours, meaning it had started within the first hour of the Draith attack. Someone had read a contractor's report, filed 2 years earlier, marked theoretical, not recommended, but possible, and decided this particular moment met the criteria. The kinetic impacts weren't elegant. They struck the Draith cruiser's maneuvering array with the practical accuracy of people who understood insertion trajectories because they used them daily for entirely different purposes. The cruiser didn't die. It lost the ability to reposition. Reviewing the strike data in his command chamber, Thurak understood for the first time that the colonists had been preparing that response before his attack was an hour old. He sat with that information. The hairline fracture in his certainty had become something he could feel shifting under weight. Mara Ilion led the boarding action onto the Draith cruiser with 8 Marines, 2 of them injured. She was one of the 2. She had stopped cataloging the pain somewhere around hour 4, not because it had lessened, but because it had become irrelevant, and she had a long practiced history of moving irrelevant things to the appropriate drawer and leaving them there until later. She moved through the Draith hull breach with the same economy she had brought into the arbitration chamber on Hollow Meridian, and the Marines behind her moved in the same register. It's the specific combination of exhausted and absolute that produces, in the right circumstances, the most dangerous kind of forward momentum. The command deck was secured at a cost everyone present would feel for a long time. Then it was theirs. Thurak was still there. He had chosen to be. That told her something the intelligence files hadn't, that whatever else he wasn't the kind that leaves when the losing starts. She adjusted her assessment accordingly, which did not change her position. She sat across from him in the command chamber. The relief fleet was establishing its perimeter beyond the hull. On the restored comm channel, she could hear Jonah Vale's voice crackling through at intervals, running systems checks with the dock workers in a tone that suggested he was deeply pleased with several things and was trying not to show it, with mixed results. Thurak's amber eyes, vertical pupils, the armored ridges of his skull, all of it carrying something it hadn't carried 41 hours ago in the neutral chamber on Hollow Meridian. Not fear, something more durable. revision. Her voice was the same voice it had always been. Flat, factual, no heat. You measured us by what we look like when we're standing still. A pause. You should have asked the Thanari what we look like when something we care about is on fire. She activated the transmission log. The Thanari diplomatic channel was still open, as it had been since the first contact session, because that was how those channels worked, maintained across all contingencies, recording everything that passed between parties for whatever framework would eventually have to absorb it. Everything said in this room was on record. The engagement data, the timeline, the 4-hour head start the colonists had taken on reconfiguring their rigs, the system status report in cargo logistics language that had guided a relief fleet home. All of it in permanent ink. She formally requested that the Thanari diplomatic channel log the engagement data as evidence for whatever came next. Then she stopped transmitting and let the silence in the command chamber become whatever it needed to become. Thurok had nothing left to say. Not because he had been broken, because he was, whatever else was true of him, not the kind of creature who says things he cannot make true, and he could not make true anything that contradicted what had just happened. Over the comm, Jonah Vale's voice crackled back into the silence, with the specific timing of someone who had not been tracking the gravity of the moment, because he had been tracking something else entirely. He wanted to know if anyone had told the colony to stand down. He had made a bet with one of the dock workers, Sarah, specifically, that the colony's second kinetic volley was already loaded and sitting in the insertion queue. And he wanted to know if he had won, because she owed him a meal from a specific transit hub restaurant on Hollow Meridian that he had been thinking about for 3 days and felt he had earned the right to collect. Mara Ilian looked at the bulkhead for a moment, almost smiled. She reached over to the tactical relay on the captured console, pulled up the colony's status feed, and confirmed that yes, the second volley was loaded, had been loaded for approximately 90 minutes. And the colony's response coordinator had sent 3 messages asking if they were cleared to fire, and received no answer because Jonah's comm relay had been otherwise occupied. She transmitted the stand down, heard the colony acknowledge it, heard Jonah, elsewhere in the hull, inform Sarah that she owed him a meal and that he was prepared to be gracious about it. The command chamber was quiet after that. The relief fleet held its perimeter. The 2 depressurized sections of Karat As were already being assessed for emergency patching. The dock workers who had helped Jonah route power through water processor channels were back in contact with their families on the surface below, most of whom had spent 6 hours not knowing. The most dangerous thing about humans was not what they were willing to do when they were winning. Thurok understood that now. He would carry it forward with the same precision he brought to everything else, because that was what the data required, and he was, at his foundation, a creature who followed the data. The data now was unambiguous. When every reasonable model predicted collapse, they had held. When communications failed, they had rebuilt them from water pipes, cargo channels, and a contractor's theoretical footnote filed away 2 years earlier against the possibility of needing it. When the window for survival closed, they had not accepted the closing. They had gone through the wall, not because they were the largest or the most armored or the longest lived, because they were the kind of thing that does not stop being dangerous just because the situation has passed the point where stopping seems like the correct response. The room held its silence,